Okay, so this week we're talking about Aphra Bin's Oroonoko, and I believe it's sometimes titled Oroonoko or the Royal Slave. Um, it's an interesting narrative, and I know I've mentioned it several times, largely because it's the most problematic narrative we'll read in this course. It was written in 1688, right? And Aphra Bin was born in 1640. And so I had mentioned earlier in the course the East India Trading Company, and they were this huge corporation that existed in England in this era we call the early modern period, which would be the turn of the 16th century, the turn of the 17th century, so into 1600 till right about the Renaissance, so towards the end of that century, 1680s. We often call that the early modern period. It's marked by a number of things, but it's really marked by the creation and growth of the middle class as a concept. Before that, there was no such thing as a real middle class, right? There was like the aristocracy, and then there was like the proletariat, the people that worked to support the aristocracy. There weren't two. There wasn't a third. There were only two. The sort of dichotomous setup in society where you were either one or the other. You were born poor, or you were born rich, and you were going to die poor, or you were going to die rich. In this era, though, trade and international trade, largely because of technology, becomes a real thing. Before this, if you wanted to trade something across nations, if you wanted to get some product, a global product from like China, someone had to walk it from China to England, right? Not that they walked it themselves, but it would trade hands along the way, and each time it would be marked up. And I had mentioned this in a previous lecture, the East India Trading Company specifically was to find routes to India and the West, the Orient, so that they could get those commodity goods into Europe at a cheaper rate and B, a more timely rate, right? Because it took a long time to walk across all of Asia and Europe. And so in that way, this allowed for an emerging middle class, very earliest of what we would think would be an emerging middle class. You see some of this in authors like Chaucer. He was born in sort of a middle class, and he wrote a couple of hundred years before this, but it wasn't as prevalent. It starts to, and this is around Shakespeare's time when Shakespeare wrote, so Aphra Bin would have been a contemporary of Shakespeare. This is about the time when you really see a true middle class that has voting power, right? That has a sort of economic power, that they actually have some political clout that they can in fact engage with the aristocracy. Before this, you had to be land-owning gentry. You had to be born, and the sort of wealth that you had would have been land specifically. And land, if you think about it in a place like England, is, it's worth a lot of money. It's a commodity because there's not that much of it. There's lots of people. It's not like the United States, in which we had copious amounts of land at this time, right? So that's really the sort of context for which Oroonoko begins. There's slave traders on the west coast of Africa, collecting people as well as goods and other things, and transporting them to the New World. And when they transport them to the New World, they're transporting what we call the transatlantic slave trade. And that's really what we're talking about when we talk about the American slave trade. Sometimes that expression is used specifically to talk about it, transatlantic slave trade. And I think I've actually listed Oroonoko as, like, instead of listing a specific country, I listed as the transatlantic slave trade, specifically because it takes place on the west coast of Africa and then in the Caribbean, in a place called Suriname, which is not a country anymore. I think that they would be in sort of modern day Brazil in that area. So the Caribbean, northern South America, is sort of where this narrative takes place, the bulk of it. The first couple of 30 or so pages takes place in Africa, and then the rest, the other 50 or so, take place in the New World. It is about this man who is in love with a woman, and his grandfather, who is the king. He's a prince, and his grandfather, who's the king, sees the woman, and he's like, she's mine. I have true authoritarian rule. I can do whatever I want, and I want her. And so through the events, as you read through, you'll see that he, in fact, he violates, I guess, some customs of the community, and that leads to one thing leads to another, and he ends up being sold into slavery, being captured into slavery. It's interesting to think about this novel in terms of critical race theory, or novella. It's really not that long. It's not really long enough to be a novel per se, but it is a longer piece. Imagine it's a pretty long short story, and that's what a novella is, really. About 100 pages is usually what we consider a novella. Oftentimes, Heart of Darkness is cited as like the general length of a novella, and it's about 100 pages. So critical race theory is the idea that there's cachet in whiteness, that whiteness has value in a way that like blackness doesn't, or that whiteness is more valuable than blackness. Whether you buy into that as a political ideology or a social ideology or a social construct that actually exists, that's fine. But this novel, this novella, in fact, really does traffic in that sort of linguistic moves, those rhetorical moves, in which Aphra Behn continually talks up Oroonoko's whiteness and diminishes his blackness. She's constantly making these comparisons about how he is European-like, even though he's an African, and a black African at that. He's enough like a European that he has some white cachet. Is he the same as a white person? No, not to her, right? But there is some cachet inherent in the fact that A, he's educated, you know, B, he comes from some royal lineage, right? And then C, he has some white features. And she constantly, when she first describes him, she describes his high cheekbones and his Roman nose. And so in that way, she's actually associating him with certain white features, right? That in of itself is to give him some value when compared to other black Africans and how they are depicted in the narrative. This in no way is an anti-slave narrative, right? It's not like Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's not like any of the sort of slave narratives that have come out of the South, you know, in the 1840s. It's not like that. This is not an abolitionist novel. And in an abolitionist novel, I mean, this is not a narrative that is inherently trying to end slavery. Aphra Behn, the author, seemingly is fine with slavery as a concept. It's just that this individual slave, because he has some of these white features and elements, there's enough white aspects of his personality and his ethnic background, or his, like, at least features, right? That he shouldn't be treated this way. That it's sort of a tragedy that he gets treated this way, but it's not a tragedy that black individuals get treated this way. So this narrative is not necessarily forward thinking in that way. It's not at all what I would call progressive. In fact, at times, the novel's sort of hard to read because of that. It really does diminish the treatment of black Africans, you know, the individuals that were the victims of the transatlantic slave trade in the New World. It does sort of diminish that the responsibility, the horribleness, the horrors of it all. And so in that, the novel in and of itself hasn't aged well. But it's important because, well, one, it's written by Aphra Behn, who's often considered like one of the first real female writers. Not that I mean, you know, there was Sappho and there was Christine de Pizan, but they were sort of minimized in terms of like the historical value, you know, over the course of, you know, the last 1,000 or some odd years. Aphra Behn, however, she was sort of the first notable woman to make a living writing. She's a playwright, a poet, novels were sort of in their early days at this point, so novels were a new thing. They didn't quite exist in the same way that we think of. Sometimes people cite Cervantes's Don Quixote as the first novel. And this would have been written, you know, around that time, maybe a little earlier. So sometimes it's considered the first novel. It just depends on who you talk to. But a novel in that it's prose fiction, right? It's not written in verse in the way that the Telequillo was written in verse. So it's important for that reason, but it's also important as it depicts sort of the rise of mercantilism and how mercantilism is directly responsible for slavery. Mercantilism being the idea of international global trade and the moving of goods from one space to another to, you know, profit. And then it also depicts the early days of sort of, well, not the early days, but sort of the heyday of the transatlantic slave trade. And it shows that in a pretty graphic manner. I will say this novel ends in a very violent sort of, it doesn't end positively for our hero, let's just say that. And as you read it, you'll see what I'm talking about. So keep that in mind, right? This idea of critical race theory and the value of it, even if you don't buy into it as a concept, think about it in terms of the narrative, right? The value of whiteness in this story, because it does play a huge role. And then also think about how there seems to be this like privileging of their love story and some agency that they get. And this is sort of goes back to the whiteness thing, but they get, Ayamonde and Oroonoko get some sort of agency that other black Africans don't get in the narrative. And that's because of him specifically. They're both seen as sort of these regal figures. Also, much like Things Fall Apart, the depiction of the African characters, especially the grandfather character, it's not positive. So I think this is one of those narratives too, much like Things Fall Apart, although this is way less nuanced than Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart has like this true sort of egalitarian intention and an idea to show that everyone's ubiquitous and we're in many ways the same. This doesn't intend to do that. In many ways, this tends to show Africans as savages and the way that they react, to European rule as inherently bad. But it does depict both cultures as being brutal, right? It depicts the West Indies slave owners as being brutal, and it depicts the African, leaders, the despot that is this grandfather, as being brutal. And so that's another thing to look at. And I'm curious about any of the themes that you see within the narrative. I will say this is a tough read. There won't be a quiz over this next week because we're going to go into the midterm, but the following week there will be a quiz on this. That doesn't mean that there won't be a question on the midterm about this particular text, so keep that in mind. It may come up. So ideally, you should have this read by next Thursday, as you would anything else. So we'll see. We'll see how much I privilege it when I put on the test. Next Tuesday, I was going to give sort of an overview of the midterm, and so that would give you the opportunity to I will have written the test by then, and so it'll give me some idea of what I'm, what you need to focus on. So we'll talk about it as we go forward.